Good morning and welcome to Hope Church KC Online. I'm Jason and this is Betsy Davis, and we're so glad that you joined us today. We want to wish all the ladies out there a very special Mother's Day today.
We are thrilled that you're here, and today we're going to be continuing our current series called Night. And before we continue to dive into what God does when life is dark, we want to invite you to worship with us. So wherever you are in your home, we just want you to turn that room into your sanctuary, tune out all of your distractions, and join us together as we worship God.
Good morning, Hope Church. We are so glad that you're here with us on this Facebook live stream. We're going to sing to Jesus. And we're going to say that he's the king of our heart and that he's worthy of all of our praise and all of our worship and that he never fails us. So sing with me, church.
Let the king of my heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from. Oh, he is my song. Let the king of my heart be the shadow where I hide, the ransom for my life. Oh, he is my song, 'cause you are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, you're good. Oh, you are good, you're good. Oh, let the king of my heart be the wind without my sails, the anchor in the waves. Oh, he is my song. Let the king of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the echo of my days. He is my song, 'cause you are good, you're good. Oh, you are good, you're good. Oh, you are good, you're good. Oh, you are good, you're good. Oh.
You're never gonna let me down. 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 You are good, I worship you. I worship you. Sing this out. You are, 'cause you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. Yes, it is. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are.
You are here, touching every heart. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, healing every heart. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, turning lives around. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, mending every heart. I worship you. I worship you. 'Cause you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. 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 Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop, you never stop working. You never stop, you never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop, you never stop working. You never stop, you never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop, you never stop working. You never stop, you never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop, you never stop working. You never stop, you never stop working. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. 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 Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are.
God, we're so grateful for your presence in our life. I thank you for the opportunity we get to sing to a God who loves us, a God who never fails us and never leaves us, and a God who is a miracle working God, and he makes a way when there's no way. God, thank you for that. And I pray as Jason preaches his sermon, I just pray that you'd speak through him, speak through our hearts, God. We want to know something new about your goodness and your kindness, and help us to get through the darkest moments in our life. So God, we lean in on your presence this morning. So we love you so much. And we pray this in your name. Amen.
Thank you guys for leading us this morning in worship. You know, it's an incredible reminder to know that no matter what we go through, no matter what we feel, no matter how life might look, God is with us and He can make a way. Even if it feels like there is no way, He's walking with you right now. And just hold on to that, cling to that hope, because God has a plan and He will walk with you through this. And as we kind of move forward on our service this morning, before we get into the next part of our message series, Night, wanted to give you an opportunity to be generous. If you're ready to do that, you can go on our website and you can give at hopechurchkc.com/give, or you can text any dollar amount to the number that's on the screen right now. And if you've never done that before, it's very simple. A simple prompt will come up and it'll walk you through how to do that. And if you're watching today and you're brand new with us, thank you for joining us. We don't want you to feel any pressure to give. Just sit back, relax, and enjoy the message as we continue our series, Night. Have you ever felt overlooked or forgotten before? Somebody that you cared for and you thought that they cared for you, but when it came down to it, you needed them to be there for you, but when it mattered most, they weren't. And the result was that you felt unimportant, like you didn't matter, you were overlooked. Feeling forgotten, that can make life feel really dark, and that can damage relationships. And maybe it's something as innocent as like you got separated from your family at a theme park when you were a kid, or you were left behind by friends who drove you somewhere. But maybe for you, maybe it's more serious. Maybe that's why your current relationships look the way that they do. Maybe that's been the story with your parents or with a former spouse, or maybe that's with the story with someone you used to call a friend. Maybe that's been your story with God or with church. None of us like feeling unimportant or forgotten when it comes to people in our life, but it's even harder when we feel that way with God. And when we feel like God's forgotten us and we don't matter to Him, we naturally have questions like, why don't you seem to care? Aren't you going to do something about what I'm going through? Aren't I important to you? Why won't you help me? Where are you and what are you doing? And why am I going through this? Why are you allowing this darkness? When our life gets dark, as it can be demoralizing and it can be discouraging. And even if we believe and follow Jesus, we could still wonder, God, do you even care? So what should we do and how should we respond in our life when life gets dark, when we feel angry with God and we have questions and our questions need answers? That's what we're wrestling with in this series, Night, that we continue this morning. We've been looking at real people who've experienced real pain and real darkness in their own lives. And we've been watching what God has done in response and what God's done in that darkness and in their life through them. And so as we've watched, we've been encouraged because our lives get dark. And so what we've seen so far is that whether it's with David, who felt all alone, or whether it was with Abraham, who felt like his dreams and his hopes were over, or whether it was like last week, we saw Moses, who just felt defeated as he walked through the darkness of his own life. What we're learning is that when life is dark, that's when God does his best work. When life is dark with God by our side, we're told that we don't have to fear the terror of night. We don't have to fear the pestilence that stalks us in the darkness. And so this morning, as we continue our series, if you've ever gone through something that's left you feeling like you don't matter and no one seems to care, not others, not God, then I want to introduce you this morning to a woman who knows exactly how that feels. That was the story of her life. Her name is Naomi. And from her experience, today we're going to see that even if life is dark with God, we're not forgotten. God actually has a plan to use our pain that we go through as a part of the good story that he's putting together in our lives. And when we meet Naomi, it's at the lowest point of her life. Not only has she just lost her husband, but she's also lost both of her sons. All the strength and the security in her life dies and disappears. And not only that, but she was far from her home, living in a foreign land. And now she's alone. She's too old to start over. Her family is gone. Her faith in God is shaken. It seems that her entire world fell apart. Life for Naomi grew silent and scary and dark. Where was God? Didn't he care? It seemed as if God had forgotten about Naomi. But things weren't always this way for Naomi. Her life used to be a lot brighter. It used to be full of life and hope and joy. Everything used to be exactly how Naomi wanted it to be. Naomi grew up in a small town of Bethlehem in Israel. It's where she met her husband. It's where they got married. It's where they raised 2 healthy boys. And for Naomi, life was simple and it was sweet. She had her family, her faith. She had her hopes for the future. Everything was working out the way that it was supposed to be. But then circumstances that were outside of her control changed everything. A severe famine hit the entire nation of Israel, and it made life hard and dark for everyone. I mean, streams and creeks dried up, the water levels of the lakes lowered drastically, and nobody could grow any crops for food. The fertile, rich farmland became dry and unforgiving, and people got desperate. And life got dark for Naomi for reasons that were outside of her control. And maybe you can relate this morning. Maybe for you, life is dark and it has nothing to do with choices that you've made or anything that you've done. You were just a victim of circumstances that were outside of your control. Somebody else made a decision, something else happened, and it affected your life. Maybe it was cutbacks at work or an accident that brought pain to your body, or maybe it was a marriage that just didn't work out because somebody else made a choice. Maybe somebody close to you got sick or worse, died. Something happened, it was bigger than you, and it caused your life to get dark. And when that happens, it's easy for us to feel overlooked by God, marginalized. It's easy for us to feel like God doesn't care, like he's forgotten all about us. And that's where Naomi was. It was in that desperation that she and her husband made a choice. They decided to ride out the famine in a neighboring country where the famine wasn't as bad. And so the scriptures tell us that they left Israel and they went to Moab, another nation nearby, and that's where they lived. And the journey from Bethlehem to Moab was about 70 miles. And while it might not sound like a long distance for us, for them it would have been, because it was over rugged and steep terrain. So that journey would have taken probably 7 to 10 days on foot. And on the surface, it doesn't seem like much of a big deal. It makes sense, right? Go somewhere where you can provide for your family, where the famine isn't as bad. But the problem with that was that this was the land that God had promised Abraham all those years before. This was the land that 300 years before all this, God had given them through Moses and through Joshua after having set them free from slavery in Egypt. This land was special. This land was tied to the covenant that God had made with Israel. And so to leave it behind and to go to Moab would have been violating the commands of God. And on top of that, living in a pagan land would have brought temptation for them to worship the gods of the other nations who didn't worship the God of Israel. And for Naomi's two sons, when they got old enough, living in a pagan foreign land, they'd be tempted to marry Moabite women who didn't worship God or value what they valued. So not only were these unwise choices, these were violations of what God had instructed for his people. But nevertheless, because of the famine, they decided that it would be okay. I mean, after all, it would only be a temporary stay. They'd be back in Israel soon. And while they were in Moab, they just determined they were going to resist those temptations. And so they left and they went to Moab. But soon after arriving in Moab, scriptures tell us that Naomi's husband, Elimelech, dies. And she was alone now, left with her two sons, and now living in a foreign land. Her sons grew up, and once they reached the age of maturity themselves, they were ready to get married. And since they lived in Moab, they married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. And this was just supposed to be temporary. But after they had lived there 10 years, both of Naomi's sons, both Mahlon and Chilion, Naomi's two sons, they died. And now Naomi was left without her two sons, without her husband, without hope. Famine had led them to leave the land God had given them behind, along with all of their family, all of their friends. And it led her sons to marry foreign wives who didn't even worship God. Now, after her husband and sons were gone, as a result of their choices, now life got even darker. I mean, there's definitely a ripple effect in our lives when it comes to our choices. Every choice that we make has a consequence, whether good or bad, whether helpful or not. And it's true that we do reap what we sow. But just to be clear here, in this story, Naomi's husband and her sons, they don't die because of bad choices. God wasn't punishing them. They might have been making unwise choices or violating what God had instructed, but that's not what caused their death. We don't know what caused their death or how it happened. All we know is that it happened. And Naomi's hopes and her dreams and her future died along with them. What we do know is that after they died, the choices that they had made that led them to Moab, it just didn't make life any easier for Naomi. It just made it harder for her. Because now she was alone in a foreign land without her husband, without her sons, and she was far away from her tight-knit community of Bethlehem, far away from any family or friends who might have helped come alongside of her and bring support to her through this tragic time. In Moab, she was alone. Life didn't get better. It just got darker. And it was dark because of circumstances that were beyond her control, the famine, but it got darker as a result of choices that they made. And that's true in our lives as well. I mean, maybe in your life you can relate. Maybe things got dark because of something you couldn't control. It was bigger than you, but in response to what was going on, you got desperate and you made some choices that just, you look back on it and they weren't wise and you regret them. And it's made your life harder and it's brought more pain and it's caused more heartache. And now as a result of choices that you've made, life is not easier. It's darker. And I know that in my own life. I've done this far too often. It's as if the night that has come because of things that I couldn't control wasn't bad enough. I end up making things worse and compounding the pain because I've got a pattern, and maybe you're like me, of out of frustration or impatience or desperation, I just make unwise choices sometimes that make my life harder and harder for those around me. That's where Naomi was. Choices that were bigger than her, things that were bigger than her and her own choices, compounding life, making it dark. And whenever we feel like we're the victim of circumstances in our life, maybe you feel like that way in your life and you wonder, I can't do anything about this. You stop sometimes and you wonder, God, where are you? God, do you still care? Why would you allow this to happen? But when we make choices in that kind of situation, choices that are unwise, that complicate our life, it's interesting that we look back on, we can regret those, but we can still also wonder if we've done too much for God to care, On one hand, does God care by letting these big things happen that we can't stop? And on the other hand, when we make choices, we wonder, God, have we done something that has made you stop caring? Have we done something that's made you stop loving us? But either way, we want to know, God, do you still care? Because we feel forgotten. We feel unimportant. We feel all alone. And that's how Naomi felt. It's at that point in her life, after her husband and her sons died, that she hears a report of how God had come to Israel's aid and how he had provided food and how things were better there now in Bethlehem. And so she prepared to return home. But before she returns to Bethlehem, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord grant you, and may he grant that each of you would find rest in the home of another husband." So translation, ladies, it's time for you to return back to your families, move on with your lives. I'm going to pray that you would find husbands and you would remarry and you would have many children. But you can't come back with me because there's just no future with me. There's just no hope with me. God has forgotten all about me. I'm just going to go back to Bethlehem so that I can die and be buried there. And at this, we're told that they wept aloud together. And Orpah, one of the daughters-in-law, kissed her mother-in-law, Naomi, goodbye. But Ruth, scriptures tell us, clung to Naomi. And Naomi's like, look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and back to her gods, back to her way of life. You should go back with her. But Ruth will not abandon or leave Naomi. She loves Naomi. Naomi is family now. And though Naomi couldn't see it at the time, in time, Naomi would be able to recognize how God's hand is involved in what Ruth does next. And it's interesting that when Naomi feels all alone and unimportant and feels as if God had forgotten her, it's at that point that Ruth displays an incredible level of loyalty and faithfulness to Naomi. And it would be through what Ruth does that God would show Naomi that he had not forgotten about her either. God was going to be faithful to Naomi. And even if she couldn't see it yet, God had a plan. And what Ruth says next is so incredible. Ruth replied to Naomi, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. You're going back to Israel, and though I'm a Moabite, your people will be my people. And though I've worshiped other gods in my own nation, your God will be my God. I'm committed to you, Naomi. You may feel like life has been harsh, and you may feel as if God has forgotten about you, and you may feel as if life is dark, but Naomi, I want you to know where you die is where I'm going to die. And I'm going to be buried there too, because I'm committed to you. I will be faithful to you. I will not leave you. I will not abandon you. I have not forgotten you. I am with you." Ruth is so incredible. She even says, "May your God, may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." It's an incredible moment. It's an incredible commitment. Ruth gives Naomi the exact thing that she feels like God had forgotten: love and faithfulness. But it's just the beginning of the story for Ruth and for Naomi. And so together they return to Bethlehem. They go the 70 miles back through that rugged, steep terrain, and they return. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" They can't believe what they're seeing. All of Naomi's friends and all of her extended family are so excited to see Naomi return to Bethlehem. But check out Naomi's response. Because in her response, it shows us just how broken down life had made Naomi. It shows us just how much damage the darkness has had in Naomi's heart and life. Naomi says, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life bitter. I've went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." Now, the name Naomi actually means pleasant. It means life. It means joy. But the name Mara means bitterness and emptiness. So don't miss what Naomi is saying. She's saying, I'm not the same person who left here. I have nothing to celebrate. I have been brought low. I have nothing pleasant or joyful to report to you. My story and my life is full of hurt, lost hopes, bitter pain. My name isn't Naomi any longer. It's Mara. My name is bitterness because my life is bitterness. God has abandoned me. God has forgotten me. My life used to be full. My life now is empty. I have nothing to show for any of my hopes, for any of my future goals, for my family, for my faith. I'm just returning here so that I can die and be buried in my homeland. Everything else is gone. Maybe you can relate to how she feels. Maybe your life used to be full, but now you feel like your life is empty. You feel broken down. You feel depressed. You feel discouraged. The darkness has damaged so much in your life. And you're asking questions like that. Where is God? And why doesn't it seem like you care? Don't I matter to you? Have you forgotten me? It's at this point that in the story, we're giving a detail that may not mean much to us when we read it, but when we look at it in the context of the greater story, it's exactly what God would use to work out his good plan for Naomi and for Ruth. We're told that when they returned from Moab, they arrived in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was just beginning. And so when they returned to Bethlehem, these two ladies, they had nothing. They were poor. They had no jobs. They had no money. They have no food, but they're in luck because it's harvest season, which means that there's work to be done in the fields picking the harvest. And check this out. This is how incredible God is. This is how awesome God is. Because years before this, when God gave Moses the law for the entire nation, he wrote into the law that the poor among them must be allowed to follow the harvesters in the fields and to be able to pick up any of the food that they dropped. In fact, the harvesters were told in the law of Moses that they weren't to harvest everything, but they were to leave some of it behind so that the poor would have something to eat. And so that everything the poor would pick up, they would be able to keep for themselves. And so since Naomi and Ruth were poor, they fit into this category. And so we're told that Ruth said to Naomi, let me go into the fields and let me pick the leftover grain behind anybody whose eyes I might find favor. So anybody who would be willing to let me follow and pick up the grain in their field, perhaps I'll find favor and I'll be able to provide food. And it's at this point in the story, I want to pause. I want to add another interesting detail that God had put into the law that he gave Moses for the nation, because God included that if there was any woman whose husband had died and who had no male children left to take care of her and to be the heirs to inherit the land, that woman in that culture with no children, no male heirs, would have been in danger of losing the land and losing all of her inheritance. And so imagine a single mom today struggling to make ends meet, struggling to get by. God wanted to protect and provide for women in that situation. And so God wrote into the law that a male relative could redeem, a male relative of the husband who had died could buy the land and could keep the land in the family for future generations. And that male relative could also marry the dead man's wife, the widow, and together provide children to ensure that the land would stay in that family for future generations, and that that man who had died had heirs and children to carry on his family name. This person in the law was called a family redeemer, a kinsman redeemer. Now, Naomi was too old to remarry and to have children, but Ruth wasn't. She was at the perfect age. And so since Ruth was married to one of Naomi's sons and had been married to him, that meant that the hope of saving their land and having future descendants, it wasn't lost. Ruth had the potential to carry on the promise and the hope, just as long as there was a relative willing to rescue them and redeem the land and marry Ruth. And so since Naomi was too old to go into the fields and to do the work herself, Ruth goes. And even though the hours were long and there were real dangers of women who were working in the fields in those days where men could attack them either physically or sexually, none of that stopped Ruth. Ruth was fearless. Ruth was committed. Ruth was incredible. And so we're told that she went out and she went into the fields and she began to work and glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, so the story says, she was working in a field that belonged to a man named Boaz, who was from the clan of Naomi's husband who had died, Elimelech. Now, maybe it's just a coincidence, but as it turns out of all the fields in Bethlehem that Ruth could have worked in that day, she chose the field that happened to be owned by a very wealthy man, and who, as it turns out, also happened to be a very single man named Boaz, who also, as it turns out, just happened to also be a close relative of Naomi's husband who had died. See where we're going in the story here? There are no coincidences in God's plan. God had led Ruth to Boaz's field because Boaz was a perfect candidate to be the redeemer of their family. And wouldn't you know it, as Ruth is working hard, guess who shows up to check on the harvest in his fields? Just then, Boaz arrives from Bethlehem. And I get the picture in my mind. I imagine Boaz rides in on his white Mustang with its mane flowing in the wind. And as he slowly removes his hat, his eye catches this beautiful young woman who's been working hard in the fields, who hadn't been there yesterday. And we're told that Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who's that young woman? Who is that young woman?" And so Ruth catches Boaz's eye. Not only because she was beautiful, it's a lot better than that. This isn't some romance novel. This was a real life love story. Ruth catches Boaz's eye because she's been working hard in the fields all day. And Boaz isn't a young man anymore. He's not merely impressed by appearances and physical beauty. He's impressed by character and integrity and a great work ethic. And he sees Ruth working hard and diligently, and immediately he can tell there's something special about her. There's something different about her, and he respects everything he sees about Ruth. And so he asks about her. And what he learns about Ruth impresses him even more. He learns that she's a foreigner. She's from the land of Moab. And she's returned with Naomi, her mother-in-law, after both of their husbands had died. And so here was this beautiful young woman honoring her husband and his mother by coming along with her to Israel and working in the fields all day just to make sure that she was provided for and that she didn't starve. And so Boaz is moved with compassion and moved in the need that Ruth and Naomi have. And so he's impressed and he decides to do something to help them. He decides to honor them and to bless them. And so he asks Ruth to stay in his field long term. So he says, "Ruth, listen, don't go and don't glean in another field. Don't go to another field. Don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Pick in my field, work in my field." He gives Ruth a job, a long-term job, and he promises that he's going to keep her safe and he's going to take care of her needs. Because Boaz could see that it was by God's plan that Ruth ended up in his field, and he felt God leading him to help be a part of the answer to meet their needs and to help rescue them. And it's at this moment that Ruth is so humbled and honored that she bows down with her face to the ground and she asks Boaz, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you would notice me, a foreigner?" I don't want you to miss what she's asking here. Hear what she's saying. Why do you notice me? When for so long in my life, when for so long in my mother-in-law's life, we have gone unnoticed, overlooked, forgotten. Why have you noticed me, Boaz? And he said, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother and your homeland and how you came to live with a people you don't even know. May the Lord repay you, Ruth, for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by God, under whose wings you have come to take refuge here in Israel." That's an interesting thing for Boaz to say to Ruth. Because of what you've done, because of how loyal you've been, because of how faithful you've been, because of how you've worked hard and lived with integrity and had character, because you didn't live as a victim of your circumstances. You just did your best with what you had. And even though life was dark, you did your best. I'm going to pray God would repay you and God would reward you. And I'm going to be a part of that and I'm going to bless you. And listen, friends, it was true in her life, it's true in your life, and it's true in my life that even if life is dark, God always honors faithfulness. Boaz heard how she had honored Naomi and her husband, and it led him to want to honor Ruth. Don't miss this. Because if what Boaz is saying were to come true, if God were to reward Ruth and bless Ruth for her faithfulness, then that meant for the first time in a long time for both Ruth and Naomi, things were turning around for them in a good way. Maybe after all these years, after all this time, after all this darkness, maybe God hadn't forgotten about them. Maybe he had a plan. Maybe he would be faithful. Maybe it would all work out for good. So Ruth goes home to tell Naomi all about what had happened that day in the fields. And Naomi, who before called herself bitter and who had nothing to live for, nothing to hope in, and her future seemed lost and just brought to an end. Here's everything Ruth is saying. And it must have felt like she was dreaming the things that she was hearing, because Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one whose field she had been working in. The name of the man I worked in his field today was Boaz. And when that name came up and Naomi heard that, and Ruth tells Naomi of how out of all the fields in Bethlehem that she could have worked, and she ended up in his field, and how he had a conversation with her, and how Boaz had already heard all about them and all about Ruth, and how Boaz had done this unprecedented thing by making sure that she had a job and that they had food and water and that they were protected from those who might harm them. Naomi heard all of this and she's in shock. She can't believe what she's hearing after all these years of loss and pain and darkness. After all these years of feeling as if her prayers to God had fallen on deaf, heavenly ears. After all these years of emptiness and isolation and feeling as if God had forgotten about her, something new began to grow. The hurt from her past was giving way to hope for the future. And in that moment, something clicked, something changed inside of Naomi that led her to think something and to say something that she hadn't said or thought in a long time. And out of nowhere, Naomi begins to just say, "The Lord bless him." For the first time in years, Naomi speaks the name of God in a way that is positive, in a way that's life-giving. May the Lord bless Boaz. And then, speaking about God, she says something that she's not said for a long time, because God has not stopped showing his kindness both to the living and to the dead. Don't miss this. She's saying God has not stopped showing kindness to her, the living, and to her dead husband. Maybe God hasn't forgotten about me. Maybe after all this time, God is still with me. Maybe after all these years, and after all this pain, and after all this loss, after all of what I've had to suffer and go through, maybe God is putting together a good plan that I never could have imagined. Maybe I'm not forgotten. Maybe God will be faithful. Maybe Boaz is what God is using to show me how kind and good he is. It changed Naomi in this moment, because God, who had before been the one who forgot about her, was now the one who was shining down his kindness upon her, faithfully opening a door for her to walk through, maybe rescue, maybe redemption. And so Naomi says something to Ruth that just from our 21st century perspective seems shocking and forward and completely inappropriate. This man is one of our relatives. He's one of our guardian redeemers. The translation of that is this: Boaz is the one who can rescue us and redeem us. Ruth, you need to go and ask him to marry you. That's what that would have meant. That's what Naomi was saying. And it seems desperate and it seems forward and it seems like, whoa, we don't even know each other yet. But in this culture, this was customary. If Boaz was in fact a close relative who could redeem the family and who could buy the land that they were going to lose and could marry Ruth and provide children, then this wasn't God forgetting them. This was God faithfully providing for them. And so to make sure that Ruth capitalized on this moment and this opportunity so they didn't lose their land and so they would have children to inherit the land for the future, she has a plan. She sends Ruth to do something that seems crazy. And it can be a little confusing for us because this isn't our culture and we don't do this kind of stuff. So I'll summarize what happens next. But Naomi comes up with a plan and she encourages Ruth to go to Boaz as the harvest is wrapping up because she knew that Boaz would be celebrating the harvest there at what's called the threshing floor, where the harvest was processed and finished, and he'd be eating and he'd be drinking and he'd be having a great time. And so Naomi tells Ruth to go get herself prepared, to clean herself up and to make herself smell good. And once he's finished dinner and after he's had drinks and he's had a few drinks and he's feeling pretty good and he falls asleep, Naomi tells Ruth to go into that threshing floor and to lie down at Boaz's feet. And there's nothing sexual about this or provocative about this. In the Jewish culture, this would have been recognized as an act of complete surrender. It would have been understood as a sign of humility and respect and an invitation for marriage. And so Ruth did it. And she went. And guess what? Boaz woke up and he saw Ruth lying at his feet, and Naomi's plan worked. And immediately he recognizes what's going on in this moment. He's so honored that this young, beautiful woman of character, Ruth, would choose him to want to marry. He knows that she could have run after any other young man. Any other man would have been so happy to have Ruth as a wife. But she wanted Boaz. And as a result, Boaz chose Ruth. And the story goes forward, and as any good love story, they get married and they go on to have children. And Boaz becomes the rescuer, the redeemer, the savior for Naomi and for Ruth and for their family. He becomes their protector, their redeemer. He buys the land and he marries Ruth, and they have children to inherit the land in the future, descendants. And here's how crazy and how awesome this story is, because the children that Ruth and Boaz had together become pretty famous in Israel history. They had a son named Obed, who had a son named Jesse, who had a son named David, who would go on to be one of Israel's greatest kings that they ever knew. And if you fast forward history about 1,000 years after this story, in Bethlehem, two of David's descendants, a young couple named Mary and Joseph, gave birth to a boy named Jesus in that town of Bethlehem, who would be the Christ, the Son of God. It's an interesting thing that at the start of our story, Naomi felt as if God had overlooked her, and as if God had forgotten all about her. But by the end of the story, she's home, she's rescued, she's redeemed, she's got grandchildren now. And Ruth, a foreigner, a Moabite, she's been rescued as well, and she's been brought into the family of God. And not only that, she's become a part of the family tree and the lineage of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. It's an incredible story. Naomi was certain that God had forgotten about her. But by the end, she came to know without a doubt God was faithful for her. And even through the darkness and even through the pain, God was still good, and God was still with her. And God, who was good, was working out his good plan in her life behind the scenes. And even though she didn't know it, in time she would see that her pain turned out to be just a part of a greater story that God was putting together, that in the end she would like. And at no point was Naomi or Ruth forgotten, and at no point had God overlooked them, and at no point was what they were going through not important to God, and at no point did they not matter to him. No. The opposite. They weren't forgotten. God was being faithful to them. He had a plan. He was working it all out for good. It just took time. And the same is true for you, and the same is true for me. God has a plan, and we're not there yet, and the end of the story isn't here yet, but in time, we can see how God will be faithful to us as well, because there are absolutely no coincidences in this story. Nothing that Naomi or Ruth went through was wasted. And in the end, their pain was a part of what God was using to put it together for good. And if Naomi and Ruth were here today and sitting in your living room or in my living room, they were talking to us, they would tell us that even if life feels dark right now and you feel marginalized and overlooked and like God has forgotten you and you don't matter and nobody seems to care, you don't have to worry, because with God, you're not forgotten. God will be faithful to you as well. After it's all said and done, in the end, he'll come through for you just like he did for them. And even in this darkness, even in this night that you're going through right now, you can trust God. Because from their own experience, they would tell you God does some of his best work when life is dark. So there are some thoughts that I want to leave you with before I close and I pray. And I hope this encourages you, because if you feel forgotten, if you wonder whether you can trust whether God will be faithful to you, know this, that darkness is going to come to all of our lives. Sometimes it happens because of circumstances beyond our control. Sometimes it happens because we make choices that we regret. We look back on and we know they weren't wise. But at no point, regardless of whether there's circumstances that are bigger than us or choices that we've made, at no point has God left us or abandoned us. He has promised to be faithful to us. He's promised to work it all together for good. He will be faithful to you, and everything that you're going through and everything that you're feeling, he will put it together to be a part of the story he's writing for your life. You're not at the end of the story yet. Just because you're in this chapter doesn't mean you're at the end. God will get you through this. And when life is dark, as it can so often be, it's in those moments, even if we believe in God, that we can feel forgotten and overlooked, and we can wonder if God even cares or if we even matter to him. And that's a normal response for any person. And that might be where you're at today. Maybe that's how you feel. Maybe you are tempted to walk away from faith because of what you're going through, or maybe you've already walked away from faith because of what you've gone through. Let me encourage you with something that Ruth learned and Naomi learned, something that I've learned in my life, that even if we feel forgotten, those feelings don't change the faithfulness of God. And he will be faithful to you and to me, just as he was faithful to Ruth and to Naomi. You are not forgotten. He knows you. He sees you. He sees what you're going through. He knows how you feel. He loves you. He cares for you. He will be faithful to you. And in time, no matter how dark it might be right now, he promises to walk with you through this. He will come through for you. And no matter your pain, God has a plan to save and to rescue you too. No matter what you're going through, no matter what you need, no matter how you might feel right now, God has a plan to use even the pain that you feel to be a part of something good that he's putting together to rescue your life and to save your life and to walk with you through this time of darkness. And while God used Boaz for Ruth and for Naomi, the good news for you and the good news for me this morning is that God has sent us his son to save us and to rescue us. And if you're far from God this morning, then you need to know that he has sent his one and only son, that whoever would believe in him would be saved and rescued today. And if you already are a follower, you already believe in God, that he has sent his son to be the one who walks with you, to be the source of strength and the source of hope and the source of your peace. He's the one who rescues and provides everything that you need. Because you got to recognize, you got to know just how important you are to God. If you feel forgotten, if you feel unimportant, you got to know how important you are to God, because you're so important to him that he sent his son for you. He's not forgotten about you. He sent his own son because you matter to him. And he wants to be more than a savior. He wants to be more than your Lord. He wants to be the source of your life and hope and your strength. He wants to be the rock you build your life on. And he said that even if he has 100 sheep, and if one goes missing, if one feels lost, if one feels overwhelmed with life, if one feels forgotten, if one loses hope, if one gives up, if one is hurting, if one is in pain, Jesus said, I leave the 99 and I go find the one. That's how important you are to him, because you matter to him, because he loves you. And my prayer today is that if life is dark for you, you'll discover that with God, you're not forgotten. He will be faithful. And that though you might have dealt with a lot of pain and darkness, in time, I hope and I pray you'll see this is just a part of what God is doing to write a very good story for you. And in the end, though it hurts right now and you wouldn't wish this on anyone, God will be faithful, because that's what he's always been. That's who he always is. And he will work it out for good for you, just like he did for Ruth and Naomi, like he's done for me. And in the end, we'll say what they said. God does his best work in our lives when life is dark. So let me pray for you this morning. So Lord, my friends who are watching this morning are walking through darkness and a night that I can't quite fully understand, but I know that you know. I know that you know everything they feel and everything that they're going through and everything that they're dealing with. And whether they're a church person or not, I pray that they would hear again today that there's a God in heaven who loves them and who is with them and who has not forgotten them, and that you want to be their rescuer. You want to be their redeemer. You want to be their source of hope and strength today. And I pray that they would turn to you right now in this night, right now in this darkness, and that they would find hope and life in Jesus Christ. Give us wisdom to know what to do with what we've just heard. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. Hey, thanks for joining us today. I hope this message encouraged you and helped your life. Join us next Sunday for part 5 of Night.